The electronic music pulsed like an artificial heart, a relentless thud against Dr. Julian Croft's ribs. He hated this place. Elysium was a sanctuary of excess, a carousel of empty faces and purchased smiles, all bathed in neon light and the cloying scent of expensive perfume mixed with whiskey. He was a stark island of cold composure in his bespoke suit, visibly displaced in an ocean of forced euphoria. It was the anniversary. 365 days since Isabella had left him. And he was here, trying to drown her ghost in a glass of single malt, but the ghost, it turned out, knew how to swim. All alone, doctor? A statuesque blonde slid into the vacant seat beside him, her red dress as subtle as a fire alarm. Julian didn't even glance at her. "I'm busy," he said, his voice as sharp as a scalpel. The woman laughed, unoffended. "Busy with what? Counting the ice cubes?" He finally turned his face to her, his blue eyes, usually so full of surgical focus and precision, now clouded with a raw, unguarded pain. "I'm busy remembering what silence sounded like before you arrived." The blonde recoiled, startled by the venom in his tone, and stood up, melting back into the throng. Julian returned to his glass, but the memory had already been triggered. A flashback, sharp and unwelcome, laughter echoing in his spacious kitchen. Isabella, her hair in a messy bun with a smudge of flour on her nose, trying to teach him how to make pizza dough. "No, Julian, you have to be gentle with it. It's not a hostile organ you're removing," she had teased, her dark eyes dancing with a light he hadn't seen in a year. He remembered the easy warmth of her hand on his, the scent of basil in her skin, the way she had looked at him as if he were the only man in the world. He took a long swallow of his drink, the burn in his throat a welcome distraction. That was the man he used to be. Before the note. A single sheet of expensive stationery left on his perfectly made bed. "I need more, Julian." Just that. No explanation. No goodbye. He had interpreted it in the only way his logical, wounded mind could. She wanted more money, more status, a life he was apparently not providing, despite his fortune. The betrayal had hollowed him out, leaving behind a cold, bitter shell. He was about to signal for another drink when a different figure approached his VIP booth. A waitress, moving with a weary grace that seemed out of place amidst the frantic energy of the club. She held a small tray, her posture professional, but tired. "What can I get for you, sir?" she asked, her voice a low murmur, nearly lost in the cacophony. Julian looked up, annoyed at the interruption, and his world stopped. The air in his lungs turned to ice. The pounding music faded into a distant hum. It was her, Isabella. Her glorious, wild curls were pulled back into a severe, tight ponytail. Her vibrant, expressive face was muted by a mask of professional indifference. And she was wearing a uniform, a short, tight-fitting black dress that was clearly designed to appeal to the club's clientele. The woman he had placed on a pedestal, the artist whose hands were meant to create beauty, was now serving drinks in a place like this. For a moment, he was paralyzed by pure shock. Then, a tidal wave of hot, black rage crashed over him, drowning every fond memory. The humiliation he felt was for him. This is what she had left him for? This cheap, degrading spectacle? The note echoed in his mind. "I need more." He let out a low, guttural sound, something between a laugh and a snarl. "So," he began, his voice dripping with a year's worth of distilled poison. "This is what more looks like." Isabella's head snapped up, her eyes, the same dark, soulful eyes from his memories, widened in sheer panic. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking as pale and fragile as a ghost. She stared at him as if he were an apparition, a specter from a life she had buried long ago. Her hand trembled. The tray tilted. The sound of shattering glass was sharp and clear, a tiny, perfect explosion that cut through the noise for a single, suspended second before being swallowed again by the relentless beat. She looked down at the broken shards on the floor, then back at him, her eyes a maelstrom of humiliation, fear, and a pain that mirrored his own. Without a word, she turned and fled, disappearing through a dark doorway marked "Staff Only." Julian remained frozen, his knuckles white around his glass. His heart, the organ he knew so intimately, felt like it was being ripped apart for the second time. But this time, the heartbreak was laced with a burning, all-consuming fury. He needed answers, and he would get them. Tonight. Isabella stumbled through the labyrinthine back halls of Elysium, the sound of her own frantic heartbeat drowning out the distant music. She threw herself into the staff locker room, a small, stuffy space that smelled of cheap disinfectant and quiet desperation. Her back hit the metal lockers and she slid to the floor, her entire body trembling uncontrollably. Julian. He was here. The ghost she had spent a full year trying to exorcise had materialized in flesh, bone, and a contempt so palpable it choked her. The way he had looked at her, as if she were filth on the bottom of his shoe. The pain was so sharp, so immediate, it stole her breath. "Rossi!" The door flew open with a bang. Marcus, the club's manager, stormed in. He was a short, greasy man with slicked back hair and a smile that never reached his predatory eyes. "What the hell was that? Do you have any idea what the crystal you just broke costs? That's coming out of your pay, you useless girl," he snarled, jabbing an accusatory finger at her. "And who was that guy? Dr. Croft didn't look happy. If you offended him, you—" "I didn't offend him," Isabella said, her voice shaking as she tried to push herself up. "It was an accident." "Accidents cost me money," Marcus shot back. "Now get up and get back to work before I find more reasons to dock your miserable pay." Before she could answer, Marcus's phone buzzed. He answered it with a sudden deference that was completely alien to his nature. "Yes, Mr. Alistair. Yes, of course. What? Right now?" "Understood." He hung up and stared at Isabella, a look of confusion and anger on his face. "Looks like it's your lucky day. Or unlucky. The guy you pissed off, Dr. Croft, just called Mr. Alistair, the man who owns this place, and he wants to see you." Isabella's blood ran cold. "I don't want to see him." Marcus let out a cruel laugh. "You don't get it. He's not asking. He bought the rest of your night. Whatever that means is none of my business. Now get to my office. He's waiting." Propelled by a toxic mix of fear and resignation, Isabella walked to Marcus's office. Julian was standing with his back to the door, looking out the small, grimy window into the dark alley below. He turned as she entered, and the intensity in his gaze made her take an involuntary step back. This was not the Julian she had loved. This was a stranger, a cold and unforgiving judge. "Close the door," he commanded. She obeyed, the click of the lock sounding like the ceiling of a tomb. "A year, Isabella," he began, his voice dangerously low. "A full year I've spent wondering what I did wrong. A year rereading your pathetic little note, trying to understand. I need more. And now I see. This place, this uniform, men drooling over you for a few dollars. Is this what more means to you?" Every word was a physical blow. Isabella felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Pride was the only armor she had left. "You don't know anything about my life, Julian," she whispered, her voice hoarse with contained emotion. "Oh, I know enough," he exploded, taking a step toward her. "I know you looked me in the eye and told me you loved me. I know you made me believe in a future, and then you threw me away like trash because apparently the money of one of the top surgeons in the country wasn't enough. You wanted the thrill of the nightlife, the fast cash." He wanted her to deny it. A desperate part of him was begging her to give him an explanation, any explanation that would make sense of the wreckage. But Isabella just stared at him, her chin held high, her silence her only defense. She couldn't tell him the truth. The truth would put him in danger. The truth would destroy him, and she would rather have him hate her than see him destroyed. Her silence was the confirmation he dreaded. To Julian, it was an admission of guilt. The ache in his chest curdled into a cold, calculated cruelty. If she wanted money, he would give her money, but on his terms. "Fine," he said, his voice shifting to a cool, clinical business tone. "Let's talk business then. You're clearly desperate. I'll pay. I'll pay for everything. Your debts, your rent, whatever it is that brought you to this hellhole. I'll clear it all." Isabella stared at him, wary. "Why?" A smile devoid of all warmth touched Julian's lips. "In return, you'll come work for me. You'll be my personal assistant. You'll arrange my schedule, my meetings, my dinners. You will live in my house, and you will witness every single day the exact life you threw away. You wanted more, didn't you? I'll give you more. More humiliation than you ever thought possible." He didn't want to help her. He wanted to punish her. He wanted to keep her close, a constant, torturous reminder of her betrayal, until the sight of her no longer hurt. Isabella felt the floor drop out from under her. Work for him? See him every day? Live in the house that was once the promise of their dreams, but now is his servant? It was an exquisite torture, a proposal born of pure spite. But as she thought of the mountain of medical bills, of the veiled threats, of the devastating secret that kept her awake at night, she knew she had no choice. She was trapped. She lifted her eyes to meet his, her own expression hardening into a mask of ice to match his. The battle had just been declared. "I accept," she said, her voice steady and cold, betraying none of the vulnerability she felt. "But mark my words, Julian, you are going to regret this." The gates of Julian's estate slid open with a silent, imposing grace. Isabella stared through the car window at the sprawling modern mansion, a masterpiece of glass, stone, and sharp angles set against the lush green hills. It was the house they had once walked through while it was under construction, dreaming of the life they would build within its walls. Now, it was her prison, a gilded cage. Julian brought the car to a halt in the circular driveway. He didn't look at her. "Mrs. Gable, my housekeeper, will show you to your room. Your duties begin tomorrow at 7 a.m. sharp." His tone was clipped, impersonal, as if speaking to a stranger he'd just hired. As Isabella stepped out of the car, an older woman with kind eyes and neatly styled gray hair approached from the front door. It was Eleanor Gable, a woman who had always treated Isabella with warmth and affection during her previous visits. "Isabella, dear." "Mrs." Gable began, her face a mixture of surprise and relief, before she caught the glacial expression on Julian's face. Her smile faltered, replaced by a confused pity. "Welcome. Let me show you inside." The pity stung more than outright hostility would have. Inside, the house was just as breathtaking and heartbreaking as she remembered. Minimalist, yet warm, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked an infinity pool and the city lights beyond. It smelled of cedarwood, clean linen, and faintly of Julian. Her room was not a guest room. It was a small Spartan staff quarter in a separate wing of the house, a clear and deliberate statement of her new status. On the neatly made bed sat a sleek, black tablet. "Dr. Croft asked me to give you this," Mrs. Gable said softly, her eyes full of unspoken questions. "He said your schedule and list of duties are on it." After the housekeeper left, Isabella picked up the tablet. The screen lit up, displaying a document titled Protocols and Responsibilities. Her eyes scanned the text, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. Her day was to begin at 7, preparing his coffee, black, 2 sugars. By 7:30, she was to be in his closet, organizing and pressing his wardrobe selection for the day. At 8, she was to review and confirm his schedule. But it was the first rule, displayed in bold letters at the very top, that truly took her breath away. "You will address me as Dr. Croft at all times." He was stripping away every piece of their shared past, starting with his name. The next morning, her duties began. The most humiliating task was organizing his walk-in closet. She was forced to touch his clothes, the soft cashmere of his sweaters, the crisp cotton of his surgical shirts. His scent was everywhere, a ghost of intimacy that made her hands tremble. She felt like a thief, an intruder in a life that was once supposed to be hers. Later that day, he summoned her to his home office. "You will be planning a dinner party," he stated, not looking up from his laptop. "For this Friday, 2 guests, an intimate affair." He slid a piece of paper across the desk. On it was a name, Catherine Vance, a well-known socialite whose picture was often in the society pages. "Miss Vance is a vegetarian. See to it that her preferences are met. I want everything to be perfect." The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. He was forcing her to facilitate his date with another woman. "Of course, Dr. Croft," she managed to say, her voice a hollow echo of itself. The final, unexpected twist of the knife came that afternoon. Isabella was on the phone with a florist, trying to arrange the centerpiece for the dinner party, when the man on the other end of the line made a lewd suggestion. "A beautiful house like that for an intimate dinner. If the lady of the house needs any help with the entertainment afterward, you just let me know," the florist said with a sleazy chuckle. Isabella froze, disgusted and speechless. Before she could hang up, a cold voice cut through the air from behind her. "What did you just say?" Julian was standing in the doorway, his phone pressed to his ear, but his full attention was now fixed on her. She hadn't even heard him approach. She quickly ended the call, her face burning with shame. "It was nothing," she mumbled. "It didn't sound like nothing." He strode over, took the phone from her trembling hand, and redialed the last number. His voice was dangerously calm. "This is Dr. Julian Croft. I believe you were just speaking with a member of my staff." "Yes, I heard you. Let me be perfectly clear. You will apologize to Ms. Rossi immediately. Then you will cancel my order. Your company's services are no longer required at this address. Ever." He hung up and turned to her, his expression still hard as granite. For a fleeting moment, she felt a wave of gratitude. He had defended her. But his next words shattered the illusion. "And you," he said, his voice laced with ice, "learn to stand up for yourself. Or do you prefer it when men treat you like you're still working at Elysium?" He turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the vast, silent living room. She was trembling, caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He had protected her, his alpha instinct kicking in without hesitation. But in the same breath, he had used her past to wound her, reminding her exactly what he thought of her and the place she now occupied in his world. He was her protector and her tormentor all at once, and she was trapped in the crossfire. 2 days later, Julian informed her that she would be accompanying him to a hospital charity gala. It wasn't a request. It was an order, delivered with the same detached authority he used for all his commands. "A stylist will be here at 5 o'clock to dress you," he stated, his eyes fixed on a medical journal. "You are a reflection of me in public now. I expect you to look the part." The stylist, a flamboyant man named Antoine, arrived with racks of designer gowns. He surveyed Isabella with a critical eye, clucking his tongue. "Darling, we have work to do, but the canvas is exquisite." He presented her with several options, a sophisticated navy, an elegant silver, a dramatic black. But then, from the back of the rack, he pulled out a final dress. It was a slip of deep, ruby-red silk with a cut so simple and elegant it took her breath away. It was also nearly identical to a dress she had worn on their first anniversary, a night filled with whispered promises and slow dancing in the living room of his old apartment. "This one," Antoine declared, "this is the one. The color is divine on you." Hesitantly, Isabella took the dress and went to try it on. As the cool silk slithered over her skin, a wave of memories washed over her, so potent they made her dizzy. She looked at her reflection, and for a moment she saw the woman she used to be. Happy, in love, full of hope. The door to the dressing area opened. Julian stood there, having just come home. He stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes locking onto her. The professional mask he wore so carefully slipped, and for a single unguarded second, she saw the man from her memories. His eyes darkened, not with anger, but with a raw, visceral ache. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken words and the ghost of a shared past. His jaw tightened. "Take it off," he commanded, his voice a low, hoarse rasp. The order was sharp, meant to erase the memory, but his reaction had already betrayed him. It proved the memory was still alive, still powerful enough to wound him. "Wear the black one," he added, turning away before she could see the full extent of the turmoil in his eyes. At the gala, Isabella was a silent, beautiful accessory at his side. She played her part perfectly, smiling demurely, and speaking only when spoken to. Julian was in his element, navigating the crowd of wealthy donors and esteemed colleagues with effortless charm. But Isabella noticed he kept a proprietary hand on the small of her back, a subtle but constant claim of ownership. Later in the evening, an older, kind-faced doctor approached them. It was Dr. Alistair Finch, a mentor to Julian and a friend of his late father. He beamed at them, oblivious to the tension simmering beneath the surface. "Julian, my boy, it's wonderful to see you looking so well," Dr. Finch said, patting Julian's shoulder. He then turned his warm gaze to Isabella. "And you, my dear, are a vision. It's so good to see him smile again. This young woman does you good, Julian." Julian offered a tight, polite smile. Dr. Finch continued, his voice softening with nostalgia. "She has the same light in her eyes that your mother had, you know. A certain strength. Your mother was a fighter, even when no one knew she was ill. She suffered in silence for so long." The comment struck Julian with the force of a physical blow. His mother. She had hidden her own illness for years, too proud to be a burden, until it was too late. He looked at Isabella, truly looked at her, and for the first time, a sliver of doubt pierced through his anger. He saw the dark circles under her eyes that her makeup couldn't quite hide, the proud, rigid set of her jaw. He saw strength, yes, but it was the brittle strength of someone holding back an immense weight. What if her story was more complicated? What if her betrayal wasn't what it seemed? For the rest of the night, he watched her. The contempt that had fueled him for days began to curdle into a confusing, unsettling mix of suspicion and a dawning, terrifying empathy. He was no longer sure of anything, except for the fact that the woman standing beside him was a complete and utter enigma. The fragile truce forged at the gala shattered a few days later. Isabella was in the kitchen, discussing menu options with Mrs. Gable, when her personal cell phone, one of the few possessions she had brought with her, began to ring. It was a cheap, prepaid phone, a stark contrast to the high-tech world she now inhabited. She glanced at the screen, and all the color drained from her face. Her expression shifted from polite attentiveness to raw, undisguised panic. "Excuse me," she whispered, her voice tight, and rushed out of the room onto the back terrace, closing the glass door behind her. Julian was in his office, which overlooked the terrace. He watched as she began to pace, her body language frantic. She spoke in hushed, urgent tones, one hand twisting nervously in the fabric of her simple blouse. She kept glancing back toward the house, as if terrified of being overheard. His jaw clenched. The doubt that had begun to sprout at the gala was instantly choked by a fresh wave of suspicion. Who was she talking to? A secret lover? The real reason she had left him, perhaps. The thought was a venomous sting, reigniting the cold anger he had been nursing. He saw her hang up, her shoulders slumped in defeat, and press her forehead against the cool glass of the door, her eyes squeezed shut. The tension between them became a palpable living thing in the house over the next few hours. He was cold and distant, his questions sharp, his orders curt. She was skittish and withdrawn, starting at every sound. That evening, he gave her another soul-crushing task, sorting and filing a year's worth of his personal credit card statements for his accountant. It was a deliberate act of cruelty, forcing her to confront the life of luxury he lived without her. The expensive dinners, the lavish trips, the jewelry he had likely bought for other women. She sat at the large mahogany desk in his office, the scent of his cologne lingering in the air, and began the monotonous work. Her heart ached with each receipt she scanned. A trip to Paris they had once planned together. A reservation at a restaurant he had sworn was their place. Then she saw it. It was a recurring charge once a month for the past 10 months. The amount was staggering, a 5-figure sum that made her gasp. It wasn't a payment to a jeweler or a luxury resort. The recipient was listed as Oakshade Wellness and Palliative Care Center. Isabella's heart began to hammer against her ribs. Why would Julian be making payments to a palliative care clinic? He was in perfect health. A cold dread washed over her as she scanned the line item for a reference number or patient name. And there it was. In the small memo field, 2 words were printed in stark, digital clarity. Marco Rossi. The statement slipped from her trembling fingers and fluttered to the floor. Marco Rossi, her father. It was impossible. How? Why? Her father was in a state-funded facility, one she could barely afford, one she hated leaving him in. This place, Oakshade, was a world away, a private, luxurious center known for its cutting-edge experimental treatments and exorbitant costs. Julian was paying for it. He had been paying for it for almost a year, without her knowledge. The pieces of the puzzle began to slam into place in her mind, forming a picture she couldn't comprehend. He knew. Somehow he knew about her father's illness. But his cruelty, his anger, his accusations, none of it made sense. She didn't even realize she was moving until she was standing in the living room, the crumpled statement clutched in her fist. Julian was there, pouring himself a drink, his back to her. "Julian," she said, her voice shaking so hard she barely recognized it. He turned, one eyebrow raised in annoyance at her use of his first name. "It's Dr. Croft," he corrected coldly. "What is this?" she asked, ignoring him, her voice rising with a hysterical edge. She held out the paper, her hand shaking violently. "What is this payment? Why is my father's name on your credit card statement?" Julian's face went rigid. He looked from the statement in her hand to her wild, accusing eyes. For the first time since she had returned to his life, he looked completely and utterly caught off guard. A flicker of something unreadable, guilt, panic, crossed his features before his mask of cold indifference slammed back into place. He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving hers. "That," he said, his voice a blade of ice, "is none of your business." The lie hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Isabella couldn't sleep. His cold denial, the flash of panic she had seen in his eyes, it all churned in her mind. She felt like she was on the edge of a precipice, and the truth was a long, terrifying fall below. Restless, she left her small room and wandered through the silent, moonlit mansion. The house felt different at night, its sharp, modern edges softened into something more mysterious, more lonely. She found herself drawn to the library, a vast, 2-story room filled with the comforting scent of old paper and leather. Perhaps a book could quiet the storm in her head. As she passed Julian's study, she noticed a sliver of light from under the door. She heard a faint clink of glass against wood. Hesitantly, she pushed the door open. The room was cast in shadows, the only light coming from a small desk lamp that threw a golden pool onto the mahogany surface. Julian was there, slouched in his leather chair, a bottle of whiskey and a half-empty tumbler beside his hand. He wasn't working. He was just sitting in the dark, drinking. He looked up as she entered, his eyes unfocused for a moment before they sharpened on her. He was drunk. More drunk than she had ever seen him. The carefully constructed walls he built around himself every day had crumbled, leaving behind a raw, unguarded vulnerability. "Can't sleep," he slurred, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "Or did you come to search my desk for more secrets?" "I wanted to know why you lied to me, Julian," she said softly, taking a tentative step into the room. He let out a harsh laugh. Lied? That's rich. Coming from you. He pushed himself to his feet, unsteady, and moved toward her. He was a looming shadow in the dim light. You want to talk about lies, Isabella? Let's talk about them. He grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong, and pulled her deeper into the study. Let's talk about why your father's name is on my bank statements. What new game are you playing? Did you put him up to this? Did you send him to me, begging for money, after you realized your little adventure at the club wasn't paying enough? No, I didn't know, I swear, she pleaded, trying to pull away, but he was too strong. He backed her up against a towering bookshelf, trapping her. His body was a wall of heat and anger in front of her, his face just inches from hers. The scent of expensive whiskey on his breath was overwhelming, mingling with the familiar, heartbreaking scent of his skin. Don't lie to me, he whispered, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He braced a hand on the shelf next to her head, caging her in completely. The proximity was suffocating, intimate, and terrifying. You wanted money, didn't you, Izzy? Is that what this is all about? Is that all you've ever wanted? He lowered his head, his lips hovering a breath away from hers. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. The air crackled with a year of repressed desire and bitter resentment. This was it, the breaking point. The audience in her mind held its breath, waiting for the kiss, the explosion, the release. Instead, he recoiled as if he'd been burned. He stared at her, his chest heaving, a look of self-loathing twisting his features. He had almost done it. He had almost given in to the one thing he wanted and hated in equal measure. "Get out," he rasped, his voice choked with disgust. He pushed himself away from her, turning his back as if he couldn't bear the sight of her. "Get out of my sight. The very sight of you makes me sick." The rejection was more brutal than any physical blow. It was a deliberate, calculated strike at her heart. She didn't need to be told twice. With a choked sob, Isabella fled the room, the sound of his ragged breathing following her into the darkness. She ran back to her room, her heart shattered into a million pieces. But as she collapsed onto her bed, one thought burned through the pain. He had pushed her away. He had pushed her away because he was terrified of how badly he wanted to pull her closer. The desire she saw in his eyes was just as strong as his anger, and that, in its own twisted way, was a sliver of hope. The following day, a heavy, oppressive silence filled the mansion, mirroring the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. Julian was nowhere to be seen, having left for the hospital before dawn. Isabella moved through her tasks like an automaton, her mind replaying the raw, painful encounter in the study over and over. His disgust, his desire, his self-hatred. It was a toxic cocktail that left her feeling dizzy and hollow. By late afternoon, the storm broke. It wasn't just rain. It was a violent, elemental fury. Wind howled around the house, rattling the floor-to-ceiling windows, and rain lashed against the glass in blinding sheets. The sky turned a bruised greenish black. Then, with a sudden deafening crack of thunder that shook the house to its foundations, the power went out. The mansion was plunged into an unnerving darkness, the emergency lights casting long, eerie shadows down the corridors. Isabella's heart leaped into her throat. She fumbled for her phone, its small light a pathetic defense against the overwhelming dark. She heard a door open and close down the hall. Footsteps, heavy and sure, approached. "Isabella?" Julian's voice cut through the darkness, closer than she expected. She jumped, spinning around to see his silhouette framed in the doorway of the living room. He held an old-fashioned oil lamp, the flame dancing and casting a warm, flickering glow on his face. His expression was grim, his hair damp from the rain. "The backup generator for the main house seems to have failed," he said, his voice all business. "The staff wing should still have power, but we need to check the main circuit breaker in the basement." Trapped. They were trapped together in the dark heart of the house, with only the storm and the crackling tension between them for company. The journey to the basement, was a masterclass in strained silence. In the flickering lamplight, every glance felt charged. Every accidental brush of their arms sent a jolt through her. The circuit breaker predictably was fried. They were stuck. They ended up in the living room, the oil lamp on the coffee table their only source of light. The storm raged outside, a fitting soundtrack to the tempest brewing between them. Julian poured 2 glasses of whiskey, handing one to her without a word. She took it, her fingers brushing his. The contact was electric. For a long time, they just sat, listening to the storm. Finally, it was Julian who broke the silence. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual anger. He wasn't looking at her, but at the flame dancing in the lamp. "About your father. Why wouldn't you tell me he was sick?" The question, asked with such raw sincerity, broke through her defenses. The whiskey had warmed her. The darkness had made her feel strangely exposed, and she was so tired of carrying her secrets alone. "Because of pride," she whispered, the admission tasting like ash in her mouth. "My stupid, stubborn pride." Tears she had held back for a year began to fall, silent and hot down her cheeks. "He got the diagnosis right after we picked out the marble for the kitchen in this house. It was aggressive. The doctors said he needed experimental treatment, things the insurance wouldn't cover. The bills started piling up. It was crushing. I was drowning, Julian." She finally looked at him. His face, in the flickering light, was a mask of shock and dawning horror. "I couldn't ask you for help," she continued, her voice breaking. "You were this brilliant, successful surgeon. I was a struggling art student. I didn't want to be your charity case. I didn't want you to look at me with pity. I loved you too much to become your burden, so I left. I thought if I could just get enough money together quickly, I could handle it on my own. The job at the club. It was the fastest way. It was supposed to be temporary. It was a confession, but it wasn't the whole story. She left out the darkest part, the part that could still put him in danger. Julian was devastated. The guilt hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He had been so wrong, so horribly, cruelly wrong. Every insult, every accusation, every act of punishment he had inflicted on her. It was all based on a lie he had told himself. "Izzy," he breathed, the old nickname slipping out, full of pain and regret. He moved across the space between them in an instant, pulling her into his arms. It wasn't a gesture of passion, but of pure, desperate comfort. He held her tightly as she sobbed against his chest, his hand stroking her hair. "I'm so sorry," he murmured into her hair. "God, I'm so sorry." She clung to him, absorbing his warmth, his strength. The embrace slowly changed. The comforting strokes of his hand on her back became more deliberate. His breathing deepened. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his thumb gently wiping the tears from her cheek. His eyes, dark and full of 1,000 emotions in the lamplight, dropped to her lips. This was it. The moment from the study, but this time it was different. There was no anger, only regret, and a deep, aching need. He leaned in, his lips parting, the surrender imminent. But then, the full weight of the rest of her secret, the secret she was still keeping, crashed down on her. This was wrong. He still didn't know the whole truth. She turned her head at the last second. "No," she whispered, the word tearing from her throat. She pushed gently against his chest. "Julian, stop. You don't understand. It's not just that." He froze, confusion and hurt clouding his features. He had just been given the key, and now she was changing the lock. "What else could there possibly be?" he asked, his voice laced with bewildered frustration. The morning after the storm, a fragile, unnerving calm settled over the mansion. The power had been restored, but the atmosphere remained charged, thick with the unspoken words and unresolved tension from the night before. Julian was quiet, his anger replaced by a brooding, confused guilt. He watched Isabella from a distance, his eyes filled with questions she wasn't ready to answer. He found her in the kitchen, staring blankly at the tablet that dictated her life. "My schedule," he said, his voice startling her. "It says I have a site visit this morning. The new research wing at the hospital. You'll come with me. I need someone to take notes." It was an order, but it lacked its usual cold bite. It felt more like he was looking for an excuse to keep her close, to try and understand the puzzle she presented. The construction site was a chaotic symphony of noise and activity. Men in hard hats shouted over the roar of machinery, and the air was thick with dust. Julian, looking completely in his element, strode through the site, pointing out plans and discussing logistics with the foreman. Isabella followed a few steps behind, dutifully taking notes, feeling more like a ghost than a person. She was so lost in her thoughts, so focused on the ache in her own heart, that she didn't notice the danger until it was too late. A crane operator, misjudging his angle, swung a heavy steel I-beam too close to the walkway where they stood. A warning shout went up, but it was drowned out by the din. Isabella looked up, her eyes widening in horror as the massive beam swung directly toward her. She was frozen, her mind unable to process the impending impact. She didn't have time to scream. In a blur of motion, Julian reacted. There was no thought, no hesitation, only pure, primal instinct. He launched himself at her, his body a shield, tackling her with the force of a linebacker. "Izzy!" he roared, the name torn from him in a burst of terror. He wrapped his arms around her, twisting his body in mid-air to absorb the brunt of the impact. They hit the dusty ground hard, Isabella cushioned by his body. A shower of smaller debris, gravel and wood splinters, rained down on them. She heard him grunt in pain as something struck his arm, but his grip on her only tightened, holding her pinned safely beneath him. The world came rushing back in a cacophony of shouts and the screech of machinery grinding to a halt. "Are you okay?" Julian's voice was rough, breathless, his face inches from hers. His eyes were wild with a fear that had nothing to do with his own safety. "Are you hurt?" "No," she whispered, dazed. "I'm fine. But your arm." He looked down. A deep, ragged gash ran along his forearm, blood welling up, dark and red against his skin. Back at the mansion, the adrenaline faded, leaving a tense, vibrating silence in its wake. Julian tried to dismiss the injury, but Isabella, seeing the blood soaking through the makeshift bandage the site medic had applied, would not allow it. "Sit down," she ordered, her voice surprisingly firm. She retrieved the large first aid kit from the kitchen, her hands moving with a purpose she hadn't felt in months. The task forced them into an intense, unnerving intimacy. He sat on a stool in the vast, sterile kitchen, his jacket removed, his sleeve rolled up. She stood between his knees, her focus entirely on the wound. Her hands, usually so steady when holding a paintbrush, trembled slightly as she cleaned the gash with antiseptic. The sting made him flinch, his muscles tensing under her touch. "Sorry," she murmured, not looking at his face. He didn't answer. He just watched her, his gaze heavy, tracking the delicate movements of her fingers as she carefully applied a sterile dressing and wrapped the wound with clean gauze. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the even more potent scent of their proximity. The anger and resentment that had defined their interactions had vanished, burned away by the stark reality of what had almost happened. All that was left was a raw, undeniable connection. When she finished, her hands lingered on his arm for a moment too long. She finally raised her eyes to meet his. They were so close she could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes, could feel the warmth of his breath on her face. "Why did you do that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You could have been killed." He stared at her, his expression a turbulent sea of conflict and confusion. He opened his mouth to give a logical, detached answer, but the truth was far too simple and far too complicated for that. I don't know. He lied, his voice hoarse. But he did know, and in that moment, looking at him, so did she. His instinct to protect her was stronger than his pride, stronger than his anger, stronger than anything. And that fact was more dangerous than any swinging steel beam. The near-death experience at the construction site shifted the ground beneath them. The dynamic of tormentor and victim, of master and servant, had been irrevocably fractured. Julian was quieter, more watchful. The cold fury in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, unsettling confusion. He found himself making excuses to be near her, asking for her opinion on trivial household matters, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the woman he had almost lost. The breaking point came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Isabella's cheap cell phone rang. She saw the caller ID, Oakshade Center, and her blood ran cold. It was the clinic. "Ms. Rossi," a calm, professional voice said on the other end. "I'm calling about your father, Marco. There's been a complication. His doctor feels you should come as soon as you can." Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. "I'll be right there," she managed to say, her voice trembling. She hung up and flew down the stairs, grabbing her purse, her mind racing. How would she get there? A taxi would take too long. She didn't have a car. She burst into the living room where Julian was reading, not even thinking about their complex relationship, only about the raw, desperate need to get to her father. "I have to go," she said, her voice choked with panic. "It's my father. The clinic called. I need to go now." Julian was on his feet in an instant. He saw the sheer terror in her eyes and didn't ask a single question. The doctor in him took over, overriding everything else. "I'll take you," he said, his voice calm and commanding. "Get your coat. We're leaving now." The drive to Oakshade was a blur of tense silence. When they arrived, the clinic was even more beautiful and serene than Isabella had imagined. It looked more like a 5-star resort than a medical facility. Julian's name opened doors. They were immediately escorted to a private suite overlooking a tranquil garden, and there, in a large, comfortable bed, was her father. He was thinner, frailer, but his eyes were clear. He looked peaceful. He smiled weakly as Isabella rushed to his side, taking his hand. "My beautiful girl," Marco Rossi whispered, his voice raspy. Julian stood back, giving them space, but his medical eyes were scanning the charts, the monitors, the IV drips. He spoke quietly with the attending physician in the hallway, his questions sharp and precise. Later, after the doctor had adjusted the medication and her father had drifted into a light sleep, Julian found Isabella sitting by the window, staring out at the garden. "He looks comfortable," Julian said softly. "He's getting the best care here, is he?" "Care I could never have afforded," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Care you provided." "Why, Julian? After everything, why would you do this and hide it from me?" Before he could answer, a weak voice came from the bed. "Because he's a good man, Isabella. Better than you know." They both turned. Her father was awake, his eyes lucid and fixed on Julian. "He did it because he knew," Marco continued, his voice gaining a surprising strength. "He knew what I had done." "Dad, no, don't," Isabella pleaded, rushing back to his side. "He needs to know the truth," Marco insisted, his gaze unwavering. "All of it." He looked at Julian, his eyes filled with a lifetime of regret. "The doctor's bills, they were too much. I was desperate. I borrowed money from a very bad man. A loan shark." Isabella squeezed her eyes shut, a sob escaping her lips. "His name is Marcus," Marco said, and Julian's blood ran cold. "Marcus, the manager of Elysium. I couldn't pay him back. He started making threats, not against me, against her. He said he would take her as payment. He knew she was beautiful. He had plans for her." Julian stared at Isabella, a horrifying understanding dawning on him. "I was a coward," Marco confessed, tears rolling down his weathered cheeks. I used your name, Dr. Croft. I told Marcus you were my daughter's fiancé, that you were a powerful man, to try and scare him off. It only made it worse. He saw it as a bigger payday. He said if I didn't pay, he would go after you too. Ruin your reputation. Bring his world of violence into yours. The final piece of the puzzle slammed into place with devastating force. Isabella didn't leave you because of pride, or because she didn't love you, her father whispered, his energy fading. She left you to protect you. She made a deal with that monster. She would work for him, at his club, where he could watch her, control her, as long as he stayed away from you. She chose to walk into hell, to keep you safe. The room fell silent, the only sound the soft beeping of the heart monitor. Julian looked at Isabella, who was now openly weeping, her face buried in her hands. He saw it all now. Her betrayal was not an act of greed. It was the ultimate act of sacrifice. Every cold word he had spoken, every humiliation he had forced upon her, every ounce of his righteous anger, it had all been directed at a woman who was secretly, silently, saving his life. The weight of his own cruelty, his own blindness, crashed down on him, and he felt like he was going to be sick. Julian stood frozen in the sterile quiet of the hospital room, the truth echoing in the space around him. He looked at Isabella, truly seeing her for the first time in a year. He saw not a traitor, but a warrior. A woman who had silently walked into a lion's den to protect him. The guilt was a physical entity, a crushing weight on his chest that made it hard to breathe. But beneath the guilt, something else was stirring. A cold, clear, and terrifying rage. It was the precise, controlled fury of a surgeon who has identified a cancer, and it needed to be cut out. He walked over to Isabella, who was still weeping silently. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle, almost reverent. "Stay with him," he said, his voice low and steady, but with an undercurrent of steel that made her look up. His face was a calm, unreadable mask, but his eyes were burning with a frightening intensity. "I'll be back." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned and walked out of the room, his movements deliberate and filled with a chilling purpose. He didn't go to his car. He went to a quiet corner of the hospital lounge, pulled out his phone, and made 2 calls. The first was to his lawyer, a man known for his ruthless efficiency. The second was to a private investigator his family had used for decades, a man who could unearth secrets from the deepest, darkest corners of the world. His instructions were simple, precise, and absolute. "I want everything you can find on a man named Marcus Thorne, owner and manager of the Elysium Nightclub. Financials, personal associations, legal infractions, health code violations. I want every skeleton in his closet, every dirty secret, every ounce of leverage. I want enough to bury him. You have 2 hours." 2 hours later, Julian sat in his car outside Elysium, the engine off. His phone buzzed. A single encrypted file had arrived. He opened it. It was more than he could have hoped for. Tax evasion, blackmail, illegal gambling, witness intimidation. Marcus wasn't just a sleazy club owner. He was a small-time kingpin with a long list of enemies. Julian walked into the club. It was early evening, and the place was mostly empty, the stale smell of last night's party still hanging in the air. He found Marcus in his back office, counting a thick stack of cash. Marcus looked up, a smug, greasy smile spreading across his face. "Well, well, Dr. Croft. To what do I owe the pleasure? Come to buy another night with your little waitress?" Julian didn't answer. He walked to the desk and placed his phone down, displaying a single document from the dossier. A detailed record of an offshore account with a very illegal-looking transaction history. Marcus's smile vanished. "What is this?" "That," Julian said, his voice as cold and sterile as an operating room, "is the beginning of the end of your life as you know it." He calmly began to list his findings. The tax fraud, the health code violations that would shut the club down permanently, the names of 2 former employees willing to testify about Marcus's blackmail schemes, I have two options for you, Marcus, Julian continued, his voice never rising. Option A. You spend the next 20 years in a federal prison, where I assure you, some of the people you've crossed will be very happy to see you. Your assets will be seized, and your name will be synonymous with informant. Marcus was sweating now, his face pale. And option B, he croaked. Option B is much simpler. Julian leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Marcus's. By the end of the week, you will sign over the ownership of this club and its property to a holding company I've established. The price will be $1. You will then take whatever cash you have stashed away, and you will disappear. If I ever see your face in this city again, or if you ever so much as breathe in Isabella Rossi's direction, we revert to option A. Am I clear? Defeated, Marcus slumped in his chair, but he had one last venomous dart to throw. You think this makes you a hero? He sneered. She'll never forgive you. Not for the way you treated her. I may have been the monster in the dark, but you were the one who hurt her every single day, right to her face. The words hit their mark. Julian felt a fresh wave of self-loathing wash over him. Destroying Marcus was easy. It was a clean, surgical procedure. But it wouldn't heal the wounds he himself had inflicted on Isabella. It wouldn't erase the memory of his cruelty, his accusations, his cold, calculated punishment. He turned and walked out of the office without another word, leaving Marcus to contemplate the ruins of his small empire. Julian didn't feel like a victorious hero.
He felt like a man who had just won a battle, only to realize he had already lost the war. Now came the hardest part, returning to the woman he had wronged so terribly and begging for a forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve.
Julian drove back to the clinic, each mile a torturous journey through the landscape of his own failings. Marcus's final words echoed in his mind. She'll never forgive you. He knew it was true. He had used his power not to protect, but to punish. He had taken her sacrifice and twisted it into a weapon against her. The thought was a physical agony. He found her in the same spot, sitting in the quiet suite, holding her sleeping father's hand. She looked up as he entered, her eyes red-rimmed and wary. She had no idea where he had been or what he had done. She only knew him as the man who had, just hours ago, been her tormentor. He didn't offer excuses or explanations. He walked over and stood before her, stripped of all his arrogance, all his anger. All that was left was a man broken by regret. "Izzy," he began, his voice raw, the nickname a plea. "I love you." The words, so simple and direct, hung in the air between them. It wasn't a grand declaration, but a quiet, desperate confession. "I never stopped," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Not for a second. And every moment of this past year, every moment since you came back into my life, I have been a blind, arrogant, cruel fool. I took your pain and I multiplied it. I took your sacrifice and I spat on it. There is no excuse for what I did. None." Isabella stared at him, her heart aching. This was the Julian she remembered, the vulnerable, honest man hidden beneath layers of pride and pain. "The contract is over," he said, his voice cracking. "It's all over. You're free. I've arranged for a trust to be set up for your father's care indefinitely, and another for you. You can go to art school in Paris, Florence, anywhere you want. You never have to see me again. I'll take care of everything. Just let me do this one thing right." He was giving her an out. He was giving her the freedom she had sacrificed everything for, expecting her to take it and run, to escape from the man who had caused her so much pain. He was preparing himself for the final, deserved blow of her departure. She slowly stood up, her eyes searching his. She saw the deep, genuine remorse. She saw the love he had tried so hard to bury under his anger. And she saw her own love for him, a stubborn, resilient thing that had survived the worst of storms. She had left him once to protect him. She wouldn't leave him again. "I don't want to go to Paris," she whispered, her voice trembling. Julian looked confused, his brow furrowed with pain. Florence, then? I can make the arrangements. Julian, she interrupted softly. She took a step closer, closing the small space between them. I don't want to go anywhere. She reached up and gently touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. I'm already home. And then she rose on her toes and kissed him. It wasn't a kiss of desperate passion, but one of profound, soul-deep forgiveness. It was the taste of acceptance, of homecoming. All the pain, all the misunderstanding, all the lonely nights melted away in that single, healing touch. Julian froze for a second, stunned, before his arms came around her, pulling her flush against him, as if he was afraid she might disappear. He kissed her back, a lifetime of regret and longing pouring into the embrace. It was a surrender, a mutual, absolute surrender to the love that had refused to die, no matter how deeply they had tried to bury it. He lifted his head, resting his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. Forgive me, he breathed. I already have, she whispered back. In the quiet of the hospital room, with her father sleeping peacefully nearby, they held each other, two broken pieces finally fitting back together. The contract was void. The debts were paid. All that was left was the truth of what had been there all along. 6 months later, the afternoon sun streamed into a bright, airy studio, illuminating dust motes dancing in the light. The scent of turpentine and oil paint filled the air. Isabella stood before a large canvas, a paintbrush in her hand, a smudge of cerulean blue on her cheek. She was no longer a waitress, no longer an assistant. She was an artist. The studio, a stunning glass-walled structure that Julian had built for her on the edge of the property, was her sanctuary. It overlooked the ocean, and today the water was a calm, brilliant blue. She was working on a portrait. It was of Julian, but not the cold, imposing Dr. Croft she had first encountered at Elysium. In her painting, he was relaxed, sitting in an armchair in the library, a small, genuine smile on his lips, the kind she saw every day now. He was reading, and the light from the window caught the gold in his eyes. The door to the studio slid open. Julian walked in, having just returned from the hospital. He had shed his suit jacket and loosened his tie. He smiled when he saw her, his eyes crinkling at the corners. There you are, he said, his voice full of a soft, easy affection. He walked up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. He looked from her painting to her face, his gaze full of admiration. It's incredible, Izzy, he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. You've captured him perfectly. He almost looks handsome. She laughed, leaning back against his chest. He has his moments. Their life together had found a beautiful, simple rhythm. Her father was living out his final months in peace at Oakshade, his every need met, his daughter happy and by his side. The past was not forgotten, but it had been transformed. I have some news, Julian said, his tone shifting slightly. The sale was finalized this morning. Isabella turned in his arms to face him. The club? He nodded. Elysium is officially no more. He paused, a flicker of excitement in his eyes. The new Rossi Arts Foundation now holds the deed. Its first act will be to award a full scholarship to a promising young art student from the city. The foundation's director is still considering candidates. He looked at her pointedly, a playful smile on his lips. Isabella's eyes filled with tears. He had done it. He had taken the sight of her deepest humiliation and transformed it into a symbol of her triumph, a beacon of hope for others. It was the most thoughtful, most meaningful gift he could have ever given her. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I love you, he answered simply, as if it were the only explanation necessary. He held her close for a long moment, the silence comfortable and full. Beside the finished portrait of Julian stood another, larger canvas. It was completely, spotlessly blank. He nodded toward it. What will you paint next? he asked softly. Isabella looked at the blank canvas, then back at the man holding her. The man who had seen the worst of her and the worst of himself, and had chosen love anyway. She smiled, a real, radiant smile that lit up her entire face. She turned and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to his lips. "Our future," she replied. Together, hand in hand, they stood before the blank canvas, ready to fill it with the vibrant, beautiful colors of a life they would finally create for themselves. By choice. Together.